Hey guys, tonight we're going to travel back to a time when a single loaf of bread could mean the difference between peace and prison. It's a chilly morning in a Renaissance town, and you are, unfortunately, a baker. The oven's already smoldering, your apron is dusted with flour, and someone's already complaining your last batch was too airy. You're not just here to knead dough. No, you're walking a legal tightrope so thin you'd have more freedom as a minor criminal. Your fingers smell of yeast, your clothes are never clean, and your stomach churns, not from hunger, but anxiety. You see, bread isn't just food in this town. It's law, order, and obligation rolled into a crusty little package. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge toward your bakery before sunrise. Cobblestones echo under your feet. The town's still sleeping, but the air already smells faintly of ash and the sour edge of yesterday's loaves. You unlock the wooden door, duck under a hanging cured ham that always bonks you in the temple, and fire up the oven. This oven is older than you. It's a hulking brick dome at the back of your cramped shop, soot-stained and grumpy, like a retired bull. It takes hours to heat properly, but if you light it too early, someone from the Bakers Guild might accuse you of fuel hoarding. See, baking bread in the Renaissance isn't just about baking bread. It's about surviving a labyrinth of laws, customs, and regulations. So Byzantine they make a tax code look like a love letter. Take your morning flour delivery. You're not allowed to grind your own. The local mill, owned by the city, or worse, a nearby monastery, dictates what you get. They mix in just enough barley to save money, but not so much that it becomes obvious. You taste it anyway. Too much, again. You sigh. You'll adjust the water and pretend everything's fine. The flour comes in burlap sacks, sealed with a wax stamp. The seal is not just decoration, it's proof you bought it legally. If a city official stops by and sees you using unstamped flour, you'll be fined or, depending on your reputation, flogged. You might try to argue that the seal fell off in the damp, but nobody will believe you. This morning, your apprentice is late. Again. Probably stopped at that tavern to flirt with the brewer's daughter. You curse under your breath, but quietly, because walls have ears. Your neighbor, the candle maker, has reported you before for supposedly using flour on Sundays. You weren't. You were cleaning, still you can't take chances. You grab a quill and scrawl today's quantities on a scrap of parchment. 5 pounds of flour, 2.5 of water, salt from the guild warehouse. Documented. Every single batch must be logged in case a city scribe arrives, which, let's be honest, is only ever when you're already behind. As you knead the dough, the sounds of the street slowly awaken. The clatter of hooves, the yell of fishmongers, the rhythmic slap of laundry against stones, and soon the bell. Oh, yes, the bell. In this town, it marks everything. Opening of markets, curfew, prayer times, and, of course, the legal moment when bread may begin to bake. If your loaves are in the oven before the bell, you're technically a criminal. There was a baker down the street who forgot once, and his punishment was a public shaming, with stale loaves hung around his neck like garlands. So you wait. The oven is ready. Your dough is rising, and you pace like an anxious cat. You listen for the bell. You sniff the dough. You mentally calculate the time it takes to bake each round. Then finally, the dull clang echoes through the streets, the sound of legal baking. You exhale and slide the first round in, but don't relax yet. Here come the measuring officials. They appear with solemn expressions and a basket full of city standard loaves for comparison. They pluck one of yours straight from the tray and weigh it on their scales. You watch the needle bob and pray you didn't use too much water. This is your life, and this is just a Tuesday. Historians still argue whether Renaissance bread laws were truly about protecting the poor or just another excuse for local authorities to wield power. Some say they were a necessary evil in a time of famine and unrest. Others say it was about keeping bakers firmly under the city's thumb, lest their loaves get too lofty, metaphorically speaking. What's undeniable is that you, the humble baker, carry an absurd amount of civic pressure on your flour-dusted shoulders. You're not just making bread, you're feeding the town, obeying the law, avoiding jealous rivals, and praying your apprentice doesn't drop a batch again. And this is just the beginning. You barely have time to pull the loaves from the oven before the first customer barges in, old Marta with her endless questions about crust consistency. She doesn't buy anything. She just pokes the bread with a crooked finger and mutters that her late husband would have made better. You nod politely. You always nod. Arguing with widows is frowned upon, especially when they donate to the church. Behind her, the line begins to form. Laborers with rough hands, boys sent with cloth sacks, a wealthy merchant's servant who refuses to make eye contact. The loaves go quickly. You calculate silently. If you sell out before the noon bell, you'll break even for the day. Barely. But then comes the real issue, the oven itself. This isn't your oven. It belongs to the city. Most Renaissance towns had communal bake ovens, and you, like many other bakers, rent yours by the hour. The city controls the schedule and the fuel supply. Miss your slot, and you either pay a hefty fee or plead your case to the oven warden, a man who has never smiled and smells faintly of garlic and smugness. Today, you're lucky. Your slot is uninterrupted. But tomorrow, who knows? You've heard rumors the mayor's cousin wants to turn the oven space into a grain storage shed. You use hardwood to fire the oven, cheaper than charcoal, but harder to control. It crackles like impatient applause, sending heat bouncing off the stone walls. The interior must reach at least 500 degrees. You test it by tossing in a handful of flour and watching how quickly it browns. It puffs into smoke in seconds. Good enough. But there's a problem. The ash from yesterday's firing hasn't been fully scraped. There's a fine layer of soot that could blacken your bread bottoms. If that happens, the city inspector, yes, another inspector, might label the loaves tainted and demand they be discarded. That's income lost, flour wasted, reputation bruised. You grab the long-handled scraper and lean into the oven's mouth, your face sweating instantly. Your arm cramps halfway through, but you don't stop. You can't. Not when Marta is probably still out there telling the cheese vendor that your bread tastes nervous. Eventually, the ash is cleared. You reload the oven with the next batch, the dough now slightly over-risen. A delicate balance. Too early, and it's dense. Too late, and it collapses like a poorly kept secret. This time, the loaves go in with a confident shove. You slam the iron door shut and exhale once again. Let's talk about those regulations. At last count, if anyone could count, There were over 30 official rules governing bread making in your city alone. Some towns went as high as 50. Each rule has an accompanying fine, ranging from mild coin loss to full public humiliation. You're required to post your prices in chalk by the door. You're forbidden from selling bread after dusk, unless by torchlight, which you're also forbidden from using indoors. You must maintain uniform crust color, whatever that means, and your loaves are to be round, unless otherwise permitted during religious holidays, when they must be oval. Historians still argue whether the sheer volume of these laws was about consumer protection or city coffers. Bread was the most common food, cheap, essential, and consumed daily. Any disruption in its supply risked not just hunger, but unrest. So the city watched you closely, not because they cared about baking, but because they feared riots. And riots happened. More than once, mobs attacked bakers accused of hoarding flour or hiking prices. During one famous incident in Florence, a group of bakers was dragged through the streets and pelted with their own dough, which is somehow both funny and horrifying. To prevent such things, the city forces you to bake at fixed times, sell at fixed prices, and use fixed ovens. In short, they make you as predictable as possible, and heaven help you if your weights are off. Enter the bread scales, a set of brass balances placed prominently at your counter. You must weigh every loaf against the town's official weight standard. If a loaf is underweight, even by a single ounce, it's confiscated. 3 underweight loaves in a week? That's a hearing before the food magistrate. Your scale has been tampered with so often, it squeaks in Morse code. You've considered replacing it, but new ones are expensive. And besides, everyone tampers with theirs. It's tradition, like hiding a dented pan when the inspector comes. Today, the scales seem to behave. Each loaf comes in slightly over, just enough to keep you out of trouble without cutting into profit. You chalk up the day's totals on the wall, another requirement, and serve the last customer just as the noon bell tolls. You sit down at last, just for a moment. Your feet ache, your back is sore, and you're still vaguely annoyed at the apprentice who has not returned, but no time to rest. You hear a rap on the door, a man in city colors. You stand. He's here to check your oven permit. Again, the man in city colors has the expression of someone who enjoys his work far too much. He doesn't smile, doesn't say hello, just produces a rolled scroll from the folds of his robe, taps it twice, and clears his throat like a pompous owl. You already know what's coming. Routine inspection, he says, as though you hadn't seen him just last week. You wipe your hands on your apron and motion him inside. He walks slowly, scanning the room like it's a crime scene, and you're the only suspect. You resist the urge to ask whether the bakery walls have changed since his last visit. He begins with the oven, of course. He squints into its open mouth, then jots something down. You pretend not to look, but you try to peek. He shields the parchment like it contains royal secrets. Next, he taps the bread racks, empty now, and then turns to the flour sacks, stacked neatly in the corner. You know what he's looking for: illicit blends. Some bakers mix in bean flour, or even ground chalk to stretch their product. You don't, but it doesn't matter. If he's in a mood, you could still get cited for suspicious appearance. He sniffs one sack, pokes another, then finally gestures to your record book. You hand it over, careful to keep your thumb from smudging the ink on this morning's entry. As he flips through, You take a moment to study him. His boots are newer than yours, but caked in city grime. His tunic bears the crest of the baker's oversight board, a loaf impaled on a sword, which feels a little on the nose. His belt carries 3 seals, a wax stamp, a pocket scale, and, most threatening of all, a little bronze whistle. That whistle, if blown, summons the grain magistrate. You've never seen it used, but bakers whisper stories of fines so massive they had to sell their mixing bowls to pay them. He hands back the book with a grunt. Loaf weights seem compliant, for now. You thank him, because you must, and he leaves, trailing judgment in his wake. You sit down again, exhaling. The bench groans beneath you, like it's also fed up with bread law bureaucracy. You sip some weak cider from a pewter cup and look at the oven now cooling. Its mouth is dark, sullen, like it's judging you too. You think about quitting sometimes, taking up something simpler, like eel trapping or dyeing fabric. But then you remember that every trade has its own brand of misery. At least with bread, you get to smell something nice while being oppressed. And honestly, what would the city do without its bakers? Historians still debate just how central bakers were to urban life during the Renaissance. Some argue they were practically public servants, feeding the masses, working brutal hours, stabilizing markets with their predictability. Others say the city treated them more like medieval vending machines, convenient, tightly controlled, and always subject to maintenance inspections. But the truth is probably somewhere in between. You're respected in a vague, unspoken way. People scowl if you run out of loaves, but they nod to you in the market. Children wave, even if they secretly believe you live in the oven. There's comfort in that. Still, trouble brews, not just the daily small troubles like sour flour or late apprentices, but bigger ones. The grain supply has been unpredictable this year. Weather's been strange. The miller's ox fell ill. Prices are rising. And when bread prices rise, the city gets nervous. Which brings us to the strange little man who appeared last night at the public square, standing on a barrel and shouting about bread conspiracy. You didn't see him yourself, but the butcher told you all about it. He claimed the bakers were hoarding grain, secretly collaborating with millers to drive up prices and starve the poor. Ridiculous, of course, but dangerous talk. The city has seen riots over less. You sigh, it's always the bakers. Nobody ever blames the fishmongers when times get tough. You decide to visit the flour depot this afternoon, maybe talk to the other bakers, see if anyone else has been inspected twice this week. Solidarity matters, even when it's whispered under breath while pretending to argue about yeast. You close up the shop for midday rest, not sleep. There's never time for that, just a bit of quiet. You light a small candle, watch the flame flicker in the dim, flour-dusted air. This is your kingdom, one of soot and crust, of wooden spoons and civic suspicion. And as far as kingdoms go, it's not the worst. At least the crown doesn't pinch. You make your way through the winding streets toward the city's flour depot, passing stalls where vendors hawk limp onions, cheese wheels slick with sweat, and a stack of questionable apples described optimistically as mostly fresh. The sun is high, casting golden stripes across cobblestones, worn smooth by centuries of sandals, boots, and carts with wheels that always seem one revolution from disaster. As you walk, the scent of roasting chestnuts mixes with the sharper tang of vinegar from a nearby pickle cart. A child runs past, nearly knocking over a basket of turnips, and someone shouts after him in a dialect you only half understand. The city hums its usual midday tune, part market, part chaos, part deeply repressed civic anxiety. The flour depot is set into a low stone building behind the grain scales, flanked by signs that read, "Authorized bakers only," in letters that haven't been repainted since your grandfather's time. You nod at the depot clerk, a man whose eyebrows suggest he once lived an exciting life, but has since settled into a permanent expression of vague disappointment. He grunts a greeting. "Here for your allotment?" You are, of course, and you're not the only one. Inside, several other bakers mill about, all of them dusted in varying shades of flour, some so pale they look like ghosts of themselves. There's Rosa, whose rolls are famous for being soft enough to chew with no teeth, and old Bartolo, who insists he knew a time when bakers could choose their own hours. That is probably a lie, but it's a comforting one. They nod at you, and you all fall into a rhythm of mutual complaint. "The new inspector's been around twice this week," someone mutters. "3 times for me," says Rosa. "He asked if my dough was rebellious." "I think he meant sticky." Bartolo leans on a flour sack. They're tightening again. Someone's been talking about bread rings. Organized collusion, they say. You roll your eyes. Bread rings, as if you and Rosa and Bartolo are a shadowy cabal of carbohydrate criminals. You barely have time to scrub the counters, let alone stage economic manipulation. But the city has always been jumpy about bakers, and with good reason. Historians still argue whether bakers in Renaissance cities were deliberately made scapegoats for broader economic anxiety, or whether the sheer importance of bread in daily life meant they were held to impossible standards, probably both. Either way, when grain prices spiked, it was never the fault of the weather or poor harvests. It was always the baker's scale, the baker's oven, the baker's secret stash of flour that may or may not exist. You think about the man in the square again, with his barrel and his shouting. It's not just idle nonsense. If enough people believe it, you could find yourself hauled before the city council, forced to explain why your morning loaves cost a halfpenny more than they did last month. You collect your flour, only slightly under your requested amount, and sign your name in the depot ledger. The clerk watches you write, like he suspects you might try to forge an entire new alphabet. You hoist the sack over your shoulder and start the walk back. On the way, you pass the town bulletin board. It's plastered with parchment. Announcements, lost items, sermons, warnings. One new notice catches your eye. Citizens, do not be deceived. Some bread may be baked with dangerous substitutes. Report suspicious loaves to the baker's oversight board. You stare at it a moment. The phrasing is vague enough to cover anything from legitimate fraud to an over-browned crust. You continue walking, sack heavy against your back, and feel something settle in your chest. Not panic, exactly, but the uneasy knowledge that things are shifting again, that something is brewing beyond flour and yeast. Back at the shop, the apprentice has returned. He's been to the fishmonger, though based on the look of him, he may have detoured through a puddle or 5. You grunt, he shrugs. You accept this as an apology. Together, you prep the dough for tomorrow. Kneading is a long physical process that makes your hands ache but gives your mind a place to hide. You push and fold, your palms pressing against the sticky resistance like it owes you rent. As you work, your mind drifts to the other bakers, to the man on the barrel, to the inspector's smug silence, to the city's long memory and even longer suspicion. You remember a story told to you as a child about a baker in a different city who once dared to raise prices without permission. The town tied a stale baguette around his neck and paraded him through the streets to chants of thief of crumbs. Probably an exaggeration, but the imagery has stuck with you. The dough is ready. You shape it into rounds, cover it with cloth, and leave it to rise. Outside, the sun begins to lower. The city changes tempo, the afternoon lull giving way to evening bustle. You light a small lantern and sweep the floor, the broom rasping against grains of flour that crunch like old snow. Tomorrow will bring more loaves, more regulations, more watchful eyes. But for now, there is peace in the quiet of the cooling oven, in the rhythm of the dough rising, in the brief satisfaction of a swept floor. Your kingdom of bread stands still, just for a moment. The bells chime vespers, sending a soft ripple through the air, like the city is sighing into evening. You're sitting on the stoop of your bakery now, elbows on knees, a cooling loaf beside you. It's just for you, this one. Crust a little darker than usual, but the kind of dark that means flavor, not failure. You break off a piece and chew slowly. The crust crackles, the crumbs soft and warm inside. You close your eyes for a moment and let the quiet settle in. But of course, peace in a baker's life is always fleeting, because here comes old Niccolo, huffing down the street in his patched cloak and carrying what looks like an enormous basket of pears. You know better. It's not pears. It's another problem. Evening, he says, pausing to catch his breath. You seen this yet? He holds out a flyer. Another one. This one's written in thick block letters that leave no room for ambiguity. Tomorrow, public inquiry on bread fraud, citizens welcome. Speak up. The location? The Guildhall? The time? Far too early in the morning for comfort. You take the paper from him, feel the rough grain of it between your fingers, and sigh. This isn't just a whisper now. It's moving into the realm of official concern. And once the guild gets involved, everything changes. Niccolo leans against your doorframe. They're saying someone's been watering flour. You arch a brow. Watering flour? He nods solemnly. To make it stretch, turns loaves strange, limp, almost steamed. You blink. That's not bread, that's trauma. He shrugs. Still, people are nervous, and the guild likes nothing more than to act decisive, whether or not there's anything to decide. Historians still debate how involved Renaissance trade guilds were in everyday scandals. Some suggest they were merely ceremonial, stamping documents and organizing feasts. Others argue they held real power, economic or judicial, even political. Your lived experience, somewhere in the middle. They mostly exist to make bakers' lives complicated and to hold occasional bread fairs with suspicious judging criteria. Niccolo lingers a while longer, picking at the crust of your loaf. You'll go, right? To the inquiry? You nod, though you haven't decided. Part of you wants to sleep through it and hope the trouble passes like a summer storm, but another part, possibly the responsible adult part, knows better. He leaves with a grunt and a stolen heel of bread, and you're alone again. Back inside, your apprentice has dozed off beside a sack of salt. You leave him be. He's young, his bones don't ache yet. You move through the quiet shop, checking dough, rearranging baskets, adjusting the cooling racks. These are your evening rituals. You do them without thinking, your body moving like a clock wound to a familiar rhythm. Then you pause at the ledger. You flip to the latest page, where you've carefully noted flour weights, batch sizes, bake times. You add one more line. Guild summons posted. It's not just bookkeeping, it's a breadcrumb trail in case someone ever questions your methods. You're not just baking, you're documenting your innocence. You climb the narrow stairs to your room above the bakery. It's modest. A cot, a small chest, a window with shutters that creak when the wind's right. You sit on the edge of the bed, unlacing your shoes, and you think about flour, about false accusations, about how the guild always seems to show up right when things start to smell even slightly burnt, and about a memory long buried, your first week as an apprentice. You were small, and the dough was enormous. You'd forgotten to close the sack of rye flour, and it rained that night. The next morning, the sack was a swampy disaster. Your master didn't yell. He just stared at the mess and said, "This is what happens when you don't respect the ingredients." You've never forgotten that. It's why your sacks are always tied shut, why you double-check every scoop, why you keep your fingernails trimmed and your hands calloused. Respect the ingredients. You lie back on the bed. The smell of bread still clings to your sleeves. You let your eyes close. Tomorrow will be difficult. You can feel it rising like dough in a warm room, slowly, inevitably, pressing outward. But tonight, for a little while longer, you're still. The bells ring early the next morning, sharp and almost smug, as if they know what kind of day lies ahead for you. You roll out of bed, joints creaking in protest, and rub sleep from your eyes. The sky is still gray, unsure whether it wants to become day or linger a bit longer in night. Your bakery smells like yeast and cold ash, the scent of work already begun and unfinished. You dress quickly, tugging on your cleanest tunic, and splash your face with cold water. The chill bites. That helps. You're going to need to be alert. You pass your apprentice on the stairs. He's got flour in his hair and a crooked smile. "Bread's resting," he says, but it looks moody. You give him a nod and head out. The streets are quieter than usual. People walk in pairs or alone, eyes darting toward the banners strung over the guild hall. It's a large, proud building, built of stone and just enough marble to feel self-important. The front steps are swept clean for once, and a handful of city officials stand around trying to look both casual and stern, which is not a combination most of them can pull off. You join the growing group of bakers. There's Rosa again, with her apron folded neatly over her arm, Bartolo scowling as usual, a few younger faces you don't recognize, new apprentices, or bakers from smaller shops who usually stay quiet. One of them whispers, "Are they really putting someone on trial?" You shrug. Nobody knows. Not really. Historians still argue whether guild inquiries like this were mostly for show, ritualized performances of public concern, or whether they truly investigated wrongdoing. Either way, they always attracted an audience. A herald appears at the top of the steps. He's wearing a hat so elaborate it could serve as emergency shelter, and he clears his throat with all the ceremony of someone who enjoys being listened to. Hear ye, the Guild of Bakers and Related Trades hereby convenes to address serious concerns of fraud, adulteration, and unwholesome practices in the crafting of bread. Witnesses may be called, records shall be examined. Let all present remember, bread is the lifeblood of the city. The crowd shifts. Somewhere, someone claps once, then awkwardly stops. You and the others are ushered inside. The hall is cooler than outside, dimly lit by high windows. There are benches, stone floors, and the inevitable smell of polished wood and mild panic. At the front of the room sit the guild masters, 5 of them, each in robes that suggest they haven't personally touched a bread paddle in decades. Their expressions range from bored to deeply suspicious. The proceedings begin with a lecture. You tune out halfway through. It's about civic duty, the sacred trust of flour, the moral decay of adulterated loaves. You catch snippets: bean flour used improperly, misuse of sourdough starter, bread is a mirror of the soul. Then the first witness is called. It's a merchant, small, nervous, and very insistent that the loaves from one specific bakery last week were unnaturally spongy. He points, not at you, thank the oven gods, but at a young baker with trembling hands. The accused stands. He tries to explain that the flour was coarse, that the humidity was odd, that maybe the yeast was tired. The guildmasters nod, make notes, and then suggest he refrain from using yeast altogether until further notice. You can't help but wince. That's not a punishment. It's a death sentence for his business. The inquiries continue. More bakers stand. Some defend themselves eloquently. Others barely speak above a whisper. One simply faints. It's unclear whether it was from fear or heat. Your name is eventually called. You rise, walk the long aisle to the front, and bow with practiced stiffness. A guildmaster, tall and thin with spectacles perched at the end of his nose, speaks. You've been operating for how long? 15 years, you reply. He nods. Any complaints about your bread in that time? You shrug. Only that it sells out too fast. There's a ripple of laughter, which you didn't intend but welcome anyway. Another master leans forward. You use standard flour sources? No substitutions? No substitutions. Any knowledge of others doing so? Careful now. You pause. I've heard rumors. No names. He taps a finger against the bench. You'll submit your recipe logs to the guild by week's end. Of course. There's a beat of silence, then a nod. You're dismissed. Back at your bench, Rosa gives you a look that says, well done, and we're not done yet, at the same time. By midday, the inquiry ends. No one's arrested. A few fines are issued. A handful of bakers are told to revise their methods, which is code for watch your back. The guild announces that flour inspectors will be conducting random shop visits over the next month. You step into the sunlight and feel the warmth on your shoulders. Relief, maybe, or exhaustion. Still, as you walk back to the bakery, you feel eyes on you. Not just from the guild, but from neighbors, customers, people who know your face and your bread, and who may still wonder whether your crusts hide secrets. That's the real punishment, the lingering doubt. You reach your door, open it, and the smell of rising dough hits you like a welcome friend. Time to get back to work. The door swings shut behind you with a soft clack, and you take a moment to stand still in your own shop, just breathing in. The scents are familiar. Dough proofing on the long bench, warm flour dust in the air, the sharp tang of rye beginning to ferment. The inquiry may have ended without scandal, but the air outside still feels heavy with suspicion. Inside, it's just bread and time. Your apprentice looks up from shaping loaves. They hang you? Not yet, you mutter. Get back to work before I give them a reason. He grins and returns to his task. His hands move awkwardly, too much pressure on the heel, not enough fold in the shoulder of the dough. You resist the urge to correct him. Some lessons need to come from crooked loaves. You step past him and check the batch resting on the lower shelf. Your sourdough starter loaves. aged just enough to taste like time itself. These are your pride, a little tangy, a little stubborn, like you. You press gently on one, still needs a half hour, just like every day. The dough teaches you patience. Behind the scenes, however, patience is in short supply. Because guess what's just arrived? A city inspector. You hear the knock first, 3 times precise, as if measured, and then the door opens and a man steps in, wearing the official sash of the Baker's Oversight Committee. It's green and gold, and clearly designed to inspire equal parts reverence and dread. "Good day," he says, already glancing around. Routine post-inquiry check. Should only take a moment. Of course it won't. You nod, gesture toward the shelves. Everything's as it was yesterday. "I'd hope not," he says, half smiling, "unless your dough knows how to resist fermentation." You resist the urge to say something snarky. Instead, you take a breath and follow as he begins his inspection. He moves like a cat in a curiosity shop, pausing at sacks of flour, sniffing here, poking there. He checks weights, scribbles in a small leather book, and hums softly under his breath. At one point, he picks up a small jar from your spice shelf. "Fenugreek?" he asks. "For the market loaves," you say. "Only on feast days." "Not everyone lists it." "I do." You pull your ledger off the shelf and show him the entries. Every purchase recorded, every ingredient accounted for. Historians still argue whether these inspections were truly about food safety or simply thinly veiled forms of political control. You're inclined to believe it's both. A show of authority disguised as care for the common good. Either way, you keep your shop spotless, your records neat, your spices tightly lidded. He eventually finishes and gives a polite nod. You'll receive your report within the week, likely just a note for more visible labeling. "Wonderful," you say, trying not to let your exhaustion show. As he exits, you catch a glimpse of another inspector across the street, entering Bartolo's shop. Poor man, his records are, shall we say, more abstract. You return to your bench, let your shoulders drop, and pick up a blade to score the loaves now ready for the oven. It's an art, really. Too shallow, and the loaf tears. Too deep, and it flattens. But just right, and the crust blossoms like a flower in the heat. You carve a cross, a leaf, a herringbone pattern, tiny gestures of beauty in a profession that often feels like controlled chaos. Into the oven they go, the heat welcomes them like an embrace, and you feel the rhythm return to your body, the hum of the fire, the flick of flour dust, the muscle memory of motion. You glance over at your apprentice, who's now balancing a tray of seed-covered rolls. He trips slightly and mutters a quiet apology. You nod at him. "They're watching us now." "I know," he says. "I could feel it." "Good," you reply. "Let them." Outside, life continues. The street vendors are setting up for the late market. Someone down the road is arguing over the price of salted olives. A lute player strikes up a tune in a lazy minor key. The world spins on, but inside, you are once again back in control of your space. You open the oven after the loaves have had their time. The crusts are golden, split just right, the aroma rising in waves. You set them to cool, spacing them with practiced ease, steam lifting from the cracks like little ghosts whispering. You did it again. You did it right. You slice one open just to see. The crumb is perfect, open but not too airy, chewy without being dense. You give half to your apprentice. Eat, then sweep. Always in that order, you grin. If you sweep first, you'll be too tired to taste anything. He bites into the bread and nods slowly, reverently. "This is really good." You don't answer. Just listen to the crunch and feel the weight of the day begin to fade. The inspector, the inquiry, the sidelong glances, none of that touches the bread, not once it's made. And you remember something your own master once said, long ago when you were first learning the art of keeping dough alive. They can take your flour, they can take your oven, but they can't take your hands. And hands remember. You look at yours now, dusted with flour and lined with work. Yes, they remember. The loaves cool slowly on the racks, releasing curls of steam that drift upward like smoke from a sleepy hearth. You take a cloth and polish the wooden counter, mostly out of habit. Everything's in its place again, everything but your nerves, which still hum faintly from the morning's interrogation, but no time for brooding. It's delivery day. You pull out your list, written in the tight, slanted hand your apprentice can never read, and start organizing the morning's orders. 1 large rye for the widow at the north gate, a batch of seed buns for the monks, 2 braided loaves for the brewer, who insists that beer tastes better when paired with bread that looks like it was platted by angels. You check the basket, tuck each item in with care, then sling the whole thing over your apprentice's shoulder. Smile, walk slow, and if you drop anything, pretend you didn't and keep going. He nods solemnly. Yes, master. And if the brewer asks for extra crusts again, I tell him you're not in the business of leftovers. You nod. He's learning. As he sets off, whistling a tune that's probably older than either of you, you get to work on the next batch. But even as you measure flour and stir the starter, your thoughts drift elsewhere, because word is there's new regulation brewing. You first heard whispers last week, a few idle mutterings from the grain merchants, a scribbled complaint from a traveling baker passed along in a bundle of invoices. Now it's the talk of the ovens. The city is considering a standardized price ceiling for bread. No more flexible costs. No more accounting for the rising price of grain or how far you had to haul water during a drought. Just a flat cap, supposedly to protect the poor. Which sounds noble, except that you too are fairly poor. You and every other baker trying to stretch 3 sacks of flour across 7 orders and hoping the next storm doesn't wash out the road from the mill. Historians still argue whether these kinds of price edicts were genuine acts of social care or a clever way for city officials to avoid uprisings by shifting pressure onto the bakers. After all, it's easier to complain about a crust than a mayor. You mix, knead, or fold. Let your fingers do the thinking. The dough fights back a little. Too warm in the shop today. You open the shutters, letting in a cool breeze, and the low murmur of the city waking fully. A man yells about onions. A cart rattles past full of turnips. Somewhere a woman sings. Not well, but loudly. You glance toward the basket ledger again. You're going to have to double production soon if this price law goes through. Less profit, more risk. That'll mean cheaper flour. Maybe even, God's forbid, cutting the olive loaf altogether. You'd rather eat bricks. It wouldn't be the first time the city passed such a decree. You recall an old parchment tucked somewhere in the guild's archive, a complaint from decades ago, ink faded but furious, about bakers being fined for selling buns with irregular weight. Someone even suggested replacing all human bakers with a machine driven by the river wheel. You smirk. Let's see a water wheel shape a decent challah. You set the dough to rise and sit for a moment on your bench, the kind of rare pause where you let the smell of yeast do the talking. That's when Rosa knocks on your open door and walks in without waiting. She's carrying a folded broadsheet. Her expression is the same one she wears when the grain shipment arrives a day late. Resignation wrapped in bread flour. "They're doing it," she says. You take the paper, scan the bold headline. City announces official bread price cap. A long sigh escapes you. "They're serious," you mutter. "Very." You both sit in silence for a beat. Outside, your apprentice returns with an empty basket and a grin, oblivious to the economic doom arriving like a second frost. "Well," you say finally, "at least I won't be the only one bankrupt." "Misery loves a bakery," Rosa replies, dry as a crust. "There's no immediate solution, no loophole. You and every other baker will have to comply. You'll make less, risk more, or try to quietly sneak in those special loaves at market stalls and hope the inspectors aren't watching too closely." You rise, brush flour from your sleeves, and step back into the dough, because whatever the city does, people still need bread, and you still know how to make it. Besides, if the guild starts another inquiry, you've already survived one. And if the city really wants to see what happens when bakers get angry, well, there's a reason the phrase bread riot exists in so many languages. But for now, you shape your loaves, watch them rise, and let the oven fire do its work. Outside, the bells toll for midday, but inside, the rhythm of your hands continues. Press, turn, fold, shape, quiet, certain, and utterly ungoverned. You don't sleep much that night. The dough rises on the bench like it always does. But your thoughts don't. They sit heavy in your chest, coiled like raw rope. The city's new pricing edict isn't just a policy, it's a message, and that message is clear. We'll thank you to keep your heads down, your loaves uniform, and your profits non-existent. Morning creeps in with soft, gray light, seeping through the shutters and landing on your mixing bowls like a slow sigh. You're already up, half-dressed, hair still wild, staring into a fresh sack of flour as if it might explain what to do next. Today, you need flour to stretch farther than it ever has, and yeast that works miracles. The apprentice appears, bleary-eyed and scratching his scalp. "Do we rebel?" he asks, still half-joking. "You don't laugh? Not yet. We try something else first." Because you're not alone in this. Across the city, a quiet resistance is forming, not in shouted protests or flying banners, but in crust and crumb. Bakers whisper in corners, trade tips in code, and invent subtle tricks that let them survive under the ever-tightening thumb of municipal law. You've heard rumors of a baker in the southern quarter who uses hollow crusts to hide second loaves, another in the east who blends lentil flour into white bread to stretch each batch by 2 fingers' width. You wouldn't dare imitate the one who carves a secret mark into each loaf sold above the cap price, like a gambler keeping tally. Historians still argue whether these were acts of quiet sabotage or simply a desperate artisan class preserving their trade in the face of impossible bureaucracy. The truth, you suspect, is somewhere in the middle. You reach for your own secret weapon. It's tucked in a canvas pouch, hidden behind a row of dusty oil jars. Your grandmother's spice blend, not a fancy one, just fennel, coriander, dried orange peel, and 1 crushed bay leaf. But it gives your flatbreads a whisper of brightness, enough to make a buyer smile, enough to make them return. Only use this on private orders, you remind your apprentice. He nods solemnly, as if you'd handed him the crown jewels. You get to work early, shaping loaves smaller than usual, but taller. Optics matter. People will feel they're getting more, even if the weight doesn't agree. You mix a fresh batch of fig buns, using rehydrated fruit that cost you more than it should. You shouldn't be making these today, but old Mari from the north side ordered them, and she pays in spun wool. You'll need warm socks soon anyway. Outside, a city official strolls by. He's not in uniform, but you recognize the clean boots and unreadable face. He peers in casually, just enough to see your shelves are full. You smile. He doesn't return it. Once he's gone, Rosa appears, dragging her cart, her arms dusted with flour, her hair pinned up with what looks like a fork. "Thought you might want this," she says, handing you a folded note. It's from a baker you trained with years ago, Matteo, now working in the merchant quarter. You haven't seen him since the fire 2 summers back, when half his shop went up in smoke, and he rebuilt with borrowed coin and too much pride. The note is brief. "Meet tonight. The ovens will be cold, but not us." Cryptic, so sure, but it smells like solidarity. You spend the day finishing orders, sending the apprentice with a sack of rye so big he nearly topples over. You stay behind, cleaning and counting, checking the ledger, double-checking weights. You're careful to log everything as though it's a perfect day, as though no rules are being bent. By twilight, the streets are painted gold. You close shop early and head toward the merchant quarter, passing butchers and cobblers, and the man who sells cheap shoes that somehow last forever. Matteo's shop looks closed, but the scent of ash and rosemary lingers in the doorway. You knock twice, pause, then once more. He lets you in with a crooked smile. "Still bake like your life depends on it?" More now than ever. Inside, you find 5 other bakers seated around a low table, all wearing the same expression, tired but fierce. Someone pours wine. Someone else passes around a tiny loaf, barely bigger than a fist. It's symbolic, not supper, a communion of defiance. The conversation begins softly with updates. Whose flour shipments are being delayed? Who got fined? Who bribed an inspector with a raisin cake? Then it shifts to planning. No one suggests a riot. You're not fools, but you do talk about pooling resources, buying in bulk, sharing sourdough cultures, passing around apprentices when someone gets sick or arrested. "Bread is resistance," one of them says. "Soft, crusty resistance." You laugh. It's the first real one all day. Before you leave, Matteo pulls you aside. "There's talk," he whispers, "that the city's new pricing rules were pushed by a group of wealthy merchants trying to edge out small bakeries. Because they're investing in mills and want bread production centralized." You ask. Exactly. Historians still debate whether such conspiracies were real or just rumors born from desperation, but it wouldn't surprise you. When money and flour mix, things get sticky. You walk home under a moon that feels more encouraging than usual. The streets are quiet, and for once, no one seems to be watching. At your door, you pause. The shop is dark, but you know exactly where everything is. The flour sacks, the starter, the jars. You run your fingers along the counter, feeling the familiar ridges, the soft grooves worn in by years of kneading. It's not much, but it's yours, and it smells like survival. You rise the next morning to the scent of ash and something faintly floral, the remains of Rosa's apricot buns, which she left on your doorstep as a peace offering or perhaps a battle flag. You tear one in half while the kettle heats and chew slowly, savoring the tang of slightly burnt edges and dried fruit. Another day under price caps, another round of creative bookkeeping and stiff smiles. But today, you try something different. You walk to the grain merchant yourself. It's not that you don't trust your delivery boy. He's a bright lad with strong arms and an uncanny knack for remembering street gossip. But there are conversations that only happen face to face, especially now when flour is beginning to feel like currency. The merchant is a wide man with a narrow ledger. He greets you with a nod and a grunt, his dusty hands still sorting oats from barley. Need 2 sacks, you say, voice neutral. 2 will cost what 3 did last year. I know, you reply. And next year, he shrugs. Depends how many bakers survive the winter. It's not a threat, just math. You pay more than you can afford and leave with the feeling that you've just bought sand in a sieve. But the flour is clean, and for now, that's enough. As you return to the shop, a group of children runs past you, chasing each other with a half-crushed pear. One skids to a stop beside you and asks, "Do you have any sweet rolls left?" You don't, but you break a crust from yesterday's end loaf and hand it to her anyway. She grins. Tastes like the good kind. You smile. It's probably the fennel. Back in the shop, Rosa's already waiting, flipping through your inventory book like it owes her answers. They're auditing street weights next week, she says. Random checks. Fines for any loaf of way more than half an ounce. You groan. They expect us to measure dough like gold. Maybe we should start charging like it, she mutters. You both fall silent, and the dough continues to rise. Bread has its own rhythm. It doesn't care for politics, but it does respond to fear, rushed shaping, cold hands, overproofed crusts. You remind yourself, don't let the fear into the flour. That afternoon, you spot a small gathering near the fountain. 3 bakers, 1 butcher, a fishwife, and someone who used to run a pie stall before the pie stall became illegal due to unsanitary fish handling. They're talking in low tones, handing around a flyer. You catch a glimpse, a rough sketch of a loaf with a bite taken out of it, and the words Bakers Unite scrawled underneath. Subtle? Not really. Effective? Maybe. Meeting tomorrow, one of them whispers to you. Warehouse near the dye works. Bring numbers. Bring news. You nod, pocket the flyer, and walk on. Historians still argue whether these meetings amounted to full-fledged guild rebellions or simply informal unions formed in alleyways and bakehouses. But either way, the consequences were the same. City tension, baker solidarity, and a lot of smoke rising from unauthorized ovens. You spend the rest of the day calculating how much less crust you can offer without drawing complaints. Maybe it's time to start baking flatter loaves and claiming it's the new style from Milan. You even toy with calling it airy bread and charging for the holes. Later, you test it. Shape a loaf long and thin, like a flattened slipper. You sprinkle cracked seeds on top, brush it with egg, and pop it into the oven with a sigh. The result, crisps, light, oddly charming. The apprentice names it sneaker bread. You both laugh too long at that. But maybe this is the way forward. Creativity as camouflage. Because here's the thing about Renaissance cities. The rules change constantly, but hunger doesn't. And people will always trade coin, cloth, or gossip for something warm with a golden crust. As you lock up for the night, you pass the city crier standing on a crate, shouting something about price fairness and citizen well-being. You wonder when he last paid for a loaf. Back home, you fall into bed, exhausted but weirdly energized. There's something stirring, Not quite rebellion, not quite surrender, something in between, like a dough that's just begun to rise. The warehouse near the dye works is colder than you expected. It smells like damp wool and half-finished protest. You duck beneath a hanging tarp and step into a circle of rough faces, bakers, fishmongers, a few butchers, even someone who used to run a mustard stall before vinegar imports collapsed last season. No one's speaking loudly. The tone is low, slow, thoughtful. Even the complaints feel methodical, like ingredients being measured. Mateo stands near the center, arms crossed. When he sees you, he nods once and gestures toward an empty crate. You take your seat. Someone brings out a small blackboard and writes, "Fines, flour, fraud." Rosa mutters beside you, "It's like church, but with fewer prayers and more yeast." You nearly laugh, but the atmosphere is heavy. A woman named Sienna stands and clears her throat. She's a tall baker from the river quarter, with wrists stronger than most blacksmiths. "They checked my scales," she says, "twice this week, claimed they were off by a quarter ounce, took my day's earnings in penalties. Didn't even bother pretending it was fair." Nods ripple across the room. You've all had versions of this. Inspectors are targeting shops near merchant houses. Another baker chimes in, trying to squeeze us out. Sagi, historians still debate whether these early inspections were organized intimidation or simply the result of poorly trained officials interpreting unclear laws. Either way, it was small bakers like you who paid the price. Someone else has a map, hand-drawn, smudged, showing every bakery in the city, and red X's over those recently fined, shut down, or suspiciously burned. There are too many X's. You take a deep breath. What do we actually want to do? The room stills. You don't mean revolution. You mean sustainability, preservation. Bread that isn't policed like treason. Someone says, price solidarity. No undercutting, no discount tricks. Hold steady so they can't pit us against each other. Someone else. Rotate apprentices. Share tips. Secret ingredient swaps, like the old grain circles. You offer weekly gatherings, a low profile. Share numbers, stories, support. The apprentice, yours, not supposed to be here, but sneakily in the corner, pipes up. We could all make sneaker bread. Confuse the market. Everyone turns. He flushes, and then shrugs. It's a good loaf. And suddenly, there's laughter. Warm, human, crumb-scented. You leave the meeting with a list of names and codes, flour sack marks, oven signatures, phrases for "do you have fennel?" that don't actually ask about fennel. It's a secret network built on rye, sweat, and silent resistance. Outside, the moon hangs low over the dye works, and the river smells like wet canvas. You walk home with cold fingers and a curious warmth in your chest. This is more than bread now. This is community. The next morning, you slip a tiny mark into the crust of your loaves, just a crease, barely noticeable on the bottom edge. If someone else spots it, they'll know you're part of the circle. Later that week, an older baker, blind in one eye, nearly retired, sends his apprentice to trade you a jar of honey for your seed blend. No words, just the jar and a tiny nod. This is how it begins. Meanwhile, inspectors grow clumsier. One tries to fine you for a lumpy loaf. You point out that the customer specifically requested rustic country texture. He sputters, writes nothing, and leaves with a scowl. You make a note. Add rustic country texture to tomorrow's signage. Another baker sends word that the local magistrate's sister favors her pear galettes. An opening. The next week, the magistrate's bakery visits become less aggressive. You trade that baker 2 sacks of flour for her galette recipe. It involves something called steamed butter, which feels deeply unnatural, but works. Historians still argue whether these shifting alliances among bakers and officials were bribery or simply survival. In practice, there's not much difference. You now wake up thinking less about flour costs and more about who needs help. Your apprentice designs a chalkboard menu titled Today's Mood, Mild Rebellion, and Walnut Loaf. Rosa contributes a drawing of an angry baguette shaking its fist. Customers smile. Business improves, not by much, but enough to feel it in your hands as you need. You're no longer baking for a city that treats you like a criminal. You're baking for people who leave notes in bread bags, for tired midwives, for lonely scribes who ask for the chewy one again. At night, you keep a candle lit longer than you should, writing ideas in the margins of your ledger, not numbers, names, connections, possibilities. You add an idea for the next meeting, a shared flour co-op, because flour is more than just a commodity. It's trust, it's future, it's sticky temperamental resistance. And you, of all people, have learned to shape it with both hands. You arrive at the next meeting with a small cloth bag of proof. Inside, 5 loaves of your new invention, round, seeded, hollow in the center, and oddly light. You call them moon rolls. They're just sourdough with extra air and a swirl of citrus peel, but everyone gathers around them like they're treasure. Rosa sniffs one, tastes like lemon and defiance. You grin. Exactly. The co-op idea goes over better than expected. A baker from the East District offers access to a back alley mill she's been quietly running after hours. A young grain merchant with questionable morals and a sympathetic aunt agrees to sell middling quality flour in bulk. No questions, no logbooks. The next step is creating the rotation, which bakery stores what, how deliveries are staggered, how to keep inspectors from noticing identical flour sacks moving in suspiciously rhythmic patterns. Someone suggests painting a goose on the sacks. Everyone chuckles. Then someone else suggests 3 different colors of geese, depending on contents. And suddenly, it's official. Your resistance will be led by birds. The goose system works, barely. It buys time, saves costs, and creates a bizarre sense of companionship. You catch yourself humming as you load sacks into the cellar, tracing the blue goose on the side like it's a holy symbol. But of course, the city isn't blind. Soon enough, rumors of baker collusion start creeping into council meetings. The magistrates speak in hushed tones about pricing cabals, illegal ovens, and flour cartels. It all sounds more glamorous than it is. In reality, you're still waking up at 4 a.m. to burn your fingertips on underproofed rye. Still, attention means danger. One evening, Mateo bursts into your shop with soot on his collar and panic in his voice. They raided Livia's cellar, he says. Found a hidden sack, claimed it was stolen grain. You freeze mid-need. Is she fined heavily? Her apprentice was dragged to the watchtower for questioning. Historians still argue whether these raids were strategic or symbolic, but to the bakers involved, they felt personal, targeted, like the city had chosen to punish them for surviving too well. You spend that night restocking your emergency stash. Dried fruit, sacks of barley, notes in code hidden inside a hollow bread paddle. Your apprentice thinks it's all a bit dramatic. You remind him that dramatic is what keeps bakeries from being confiscated. The next morning, a customer asks why your shelves look lighter than usual. You say you're experimenting with minimalist baking. She nods, very Venetian. You don't correct her. In quieter hours, you catch yourself reminiscing, not about glory or golden crusts, but about how things used to feel simple. A customer came in, bought bread, maybe winked, maybe scowled, but left with food. Now everything feels layered. Bread isn't just bread anymore. It's message, metaphor, and maneuver. You wonder aloud whether this is what cheese sellers feel all the time. Rosa nearly chokes on her coffee. You write another letter to Livia, folded in a wrapper shaped like a pear. She'll know what it means. Support, hidden beneath sweetness. Later that week, her apprentice returns, shaken, thinner but free. He carries a note. It simply reads, "They're watching ovens now. Be unpredictable. So you change your schedule. Open late. Close early. Bake upside-down loaves with uneven crusts and unpredictable textures. You label them artisan accidentals. Customers love it." One woman says, "I've never had bread that feels so dangerous." You nod gravely and offer her a butter knife. Meanwhile, the goose system evolves. Green goose, rye mix, blue goose, emergency grain, red goose, trade-only stock for co-op use. Your cellar now looks like an avian parliament. To outsiders, it's nonsense. To you, it's survival. You spend one evening mapping connections on your wall with bits of string and dried pasta. Rosa walks in, takes one look, and says, "That's not paranoia, that's organization." And yet, cracks begin to form. One bakery refuses to share a shipment. Another undercuts the co-op price. A third insists their sesame loaves are sacred family tradition and not subject to rotation. Stress rises like overactive yeast. You call a quiet meeting, no flyers, no crates, just 6 bakers under a drying line at the riverfront, pretending to discuss laundry. There, you say what no one wants to admit. We're going to lose people, not to raids, to burnout, fear, but to exhaustion. You suggest letting the circle shrink, fewer mouths, fewer risks, just the ones who are fully in. It's painful, but the others agree. Historians still argue whether this moment marked the beginning of the compact baker resistance, or simply the return to smaller, sustainable mutual aid. Either way, the goose count drops. You feel it in the silence and in the trust. The next day, a new customer appears, young with ink on his fingers and a strange way of posing before speaking. You hand him a moon roll. He hands you a note. Your flour sacks have been traced. Expect visitors. Prepare fennel. You nod. Time to get creative with air again. You don't panic, not yet. You do what bakers have always done when things get messy. You tidy the counters, wash your hands, and pretend everything's fine. You bake a large batch of lemon fig tarts, not because you expect customers. Word of the impending inspection has likely spread, but because you need the smell. It's calming, like nostalgia and sugar mixed into one. Then you turn to the real work. Hiding things. You slip the last sack of red goose flour behind a fake wall panel in the cellar. You stuff your co-op ledger into the hollow of a broken oven thermometer. You instruct your apprentice to act confused, innocent, and if necessary, deeply enthusiastic about sourdough hydration levels. That last part won't be hard. By the time the inspectors arrive, the tarts are still warm. They wear the city's seal, but barely glance at your paperwork. They ask vague questions about sourcing. They poke at your oven as if expecting it to confess. One lifts a rolling pin and raises an eyebrow. You tell him it belonged to your grandmother. That seems to bore him enough to set it down. They leave empty-handed. Later, Matteo sends a scrap of parchment. The tarts worked. One inspector bought 6. Keep them coming. You smile. Tired, you're not safe exactly, but you've slipped through for now. Historians still debate how much of the baker's survival came down to ingenuity versus simple bureaucratic fatigue. Most agree, a little of both, sprinkled with luck and sugar. You begin to alter your inventory. Nothing illegal, just unconventional. Lavender scones, barley fig twists, oatcakes so dense they could be used in minor construction. You rename things constantly, avoiding patterns. Even your moon rolls become sun loops for a week. A new baker joins the co-op, quiet, sharp-eyed. She arrives with an odd invention, a lockable delivery basket that can be worn like a satchel. Her name is Mireille. You like her immediately. She brings stories from the outer districts where bread is thinner, salt is scarce, and ovens are shared between neighbors like communal wells. She says they want in, but not as charity. They want to contribute. So you send word, goose marks coming their way. Share what you can. Don't expect profit. Expect resilience. Meanwhile, your apprentice experiments with quiet loaves, bread designed to be torn silently. No crust cracking, you ask why. He says, for nighttime meetings. You blink, the idea's ridiculous and perfect. You add it to your menu under midnight bites. One evening, Rosa arrives looking shaken. They seized Ronaldo's shop, she says. He didn't even do anything, just had too many sacks. It's the first full shutdown in weeks. Ronaldo is older, slower. His loaves are good, not great. He was never aggressive in the meetings, never bold. You sit on your back stoop, hands resting on your knees, staring at nothing. The moon is dim behind a sheet of low clouds. You okay? Rosa asks. You nod. Just thinking how strange it is that flour can be a crime. She sits beside you. Not flour. Stability. They don't like when people figure things out without them. You want to laugh, but you don't. Instead, you take out your notebook and quietly scratch out Ronaldo's mark from the rotation. The next day, a customer, a seamstress you've never spoken to before, leaves behind a coin pouch and a note for the old man. I liked his almond twists. You pass it along through Mireille. The goose system lives on. By now, your cellar is more message board than pantry. Dried citrus peels. In a jar mean no deliveries this week. A slightly overbaked sourdough on the left shelf. Secure safe meeting spot. Mismatched poppy seed placement. Somewhere a recipe swap in progress. Your apprentice has taken to inventing new codes, like a medieval Morse. He calls it loaf language. You pretend to disapprove, but secretly start memorizing it. Historians still debate whether this primitive code system was effective communication or whimsical over-engineering. What matters is that it gave your apprentice purpose and made you all laugh when you needed it most. Then the market changes again. A new decree. Bakers must now include a certificate of grain source with every shipment, signed by both supplier and magistrate. You look at the form and exhale. It's written in 5 different styles of handwriting and includes 3 impossible-to-verify stamps. You'll need at least 1 good forger, a dozen plausible names, and a whole new level of patience. Mireille says, I can forge, quietly. You hand her a sample and a piece of plum tart. Meanwhile, Matteo proposes the boldest plan yet. A shared bakery. 1 location, rotating bakers, disguised as a bread school for orphans. You blink, then say, You think they'll believe we're running a school? He grins. With enough chalk and chaos? Absolutely. You call it the oven. The cover story is simple. Free lessons for local youth, funded by charitable nobles. The reality? It's your new base, your hideaway, a warm-smelling war room, You spend your evenings there, kneading by candlelight, watching as the apprentices scurry through the alleys like tiny revolutionaries with flour-dusted shoes. Your city doesn't know it yet, but its quietest insurrection is being baked in plain sight. It's morning at the oven, and the smell is exactly right. You're working a new batch of hazelnut rye, a dense, earthy, good for both breakfast and bribery. Across the room, your apprentice is leading 3 street kids through the basic steps of shaping dough. They're more interested in stealing dried cherries from the counter, but you let it slide. Outside, a bell rings once, the signal. Mireille arrives, winded, holding a wax-sealed bundle of grain certificates, half real, half wishful thinking. You nod, take the bundle, and slip it into a hollow bread tin marked current seconds. Currents optional. By noon, Rosa brings word from the market. 2 more bakers fined, 1 shut down, but your decoy deliveries made it through. Someone even complimented the packaging. Very modern, they said. You don't laugh out loud, but inside, there's a warm, yeasty joy. The oven becomes more than a bakery. It's a rhythm. Wake early. Check the spice jars. If rosemary is turned backward, it means don't speak openly. Knead quietly. Listen harder. Swap messages. Teach a child how to shape a crescent roll while another delivers a forged form tucked inside a hollow baguette. Historians still debate whether the oven was primarily political, educational, or spiritual. Most agree it was all 3. It offered something the magistrates couldn't regulate: comfort. It's your anchor, even as the laws grow stranger. The newest decree: no bread may contain unauthorized additives, including but not limited to dried fruit, seeds, or anything considered flavoring beyond necessity. The phrasing is so vague, it might as well have been written by a man afraid of cinnamon. Mireille reads the bulletin aloud. So, flavor is now suspicious. You shrug. We'll just lean into bland. But of course you don't. You invent new names. Seedless fig loaves are history buns. The apricot spice rolls become tax dough. You start shaping everything into irregular lumps. Nothing uniform, nothing trackable. One magistrate complains that your bread looks unreasonably medieval. You thank him for the compliment. Then something unexpected happens. A city official, gray-bearded, pinched, perpetually damp, starts showing up at your stall. He buys a single crust each time, inspects it as if it holds secrets, then nods and leaves. You nickname him Inspector Crumb. After his 3rd visit, your apprentice points out the strange fold of paper he always leaves behind. It's not a message exactly, just bread poetry, bad bread poetry, but it's consistent, 1 stanza per week, always signed, a humble eater of crusts. Rosa reads them aloud at meetings. Mireille says it's either a trap or the strangest plea for friendship in Venetian history. You decide to write back, a verse tucked inside a hollow boule. You visit in silence, so we flavor with song. If bread is rebellion, then make it long. You never hear a reply, but Crumb keeps returning. The city, meanwhile, is distracted. A naval skirmish, a grain barge stuck in the shallows, rumors of rising salt prices. The heat softens the crackdown. Inspectors shift their attention to soap makers and fishmongers. You seize the chance to expand. The oven gains a 2nd chamber. Technically, it's a closet. Realistically, it's a meeting room with excellent acoustics. You hang a map, not of the city, of your deliveries, goose marks, dour roots, new apprentices. The network has grown, quietly, tactically. You now support 13 small bakeries, 5 grain mills, 2 forgers, and 1 unexpected ally. a retired cheesemonger named Gino who insists he was once a spy. No one believes him, but his bread storage techniques are top tier. You write new notes in loaf language. Need Gino's secret wax wrap. Matteo says fennel is over. Try coriander. Someone keeps stealing cherries, possibly a ghost. It's strange how comforting absurdity can be. Then one day, your apprentice returns from the docks with wide eyes. They've started weighing customers, he says. You blink. What? To see if they're gaining too much, if you're eating more bread than you can afford. You sit down slowly. The dough in your hands deflates with a sad hiss. Kikihu. Historians still argue whether this practice was real or exaggerated in baker lore, but to you the fear feels tangible. If people are weighed like grain sacks, what happens next? Receipts for crumbs, so you adjust again. You start baking weightless loaves, light, airy, made with tricks and illusions. They look large, they crumble easily, but they're mostly air and suggestion. People love them. You add clever names, guilt-free loaf, whisper bread, feather crusts. A noblewoman buys 5 and says she feels lighter already. That night at the oven, Mireille tests a prototype, a bread that weighs less than a sparrow, shaped like a cloud. Inside, a note. They'll never weigh what they can't see. The next morning, a street artist paints a goose with wings stretched across the bakery's outer wall. No name, no claim, just defiance in feathers. You trace the outline of the painted goose with your finger. The wall is still cool from the night air. Morning hasn't burned off the sea chill yet, and the bakery feels like a holdover from a dream. Dough resting, flour floating lazily in the sunlight, and that painted bird looking like it's halfway to taking flight. Your apprentice thinks it was the kids. Rosa thinks it was a message. You just think it's beautiful. By midday, 6 more geese appear across the district, chalked on alley walls, etched into door frames, stamped onto flour sacks and clean loops of ink. Someone's spreading the signal. Not you, not Matteo, not even Mireille. This is new. Historians still debate the origins of the winged goose uprising, as later pamphlets would call it. Some trace it to your bakery. Some say it came from a different city entirely. But everyone agrees. The symbol had become more than just a bakery mark. It was hope. With hope, however, comes attention. A decree arrives. Any business displaying unauthorized symbols of affiliation shall be subject to summary closure and investigation. The language is vague, deliberately so, but the geese are clearly targeted. Mireille raises one eyebrow. We should paint more. You agree, but quietly. The geese evolve. Some become spirals, others hide in lattices or the curve of a pastry glaze. The winged goose becomes a joke, a secret handshake, a buttered whisper. Your apprentice shapes one into the crust of a morning bun. You sell it to Inspector Crumb, who eats it in full view of the magistrate's courier and sighs happily. You wonder, not for the first time, if Crumb is your best spy or simply Venice's most chaotic poetry enthusiast. Then the summons comes. You're requested, no, required, to appear before the city's commerce tribunal. The letter is polite in that distinctly terrifying way that says, "We're smiling as we sharpen the knives." You reread it while sipping barley tea. The note trembles slightly in your hand. The meeting is scheduled for 3 days from now. No reason given. Just attendance expected. You know you can't send someone in your place. And you know this is probably about the goose system, or the oven, or the poppy seed pattern on your latest round of sleep loaves. Mireille sharpens her ink quills. We'll make you new documents. A dozen versions. You'll choose on the day. Rosa bakes a batch of almond crescents shaped like tribunal members and names them aloud. This one's Bartolomeo. I bit off his hat. Mateo sends a wrapped cheese with a single note. In case of emergency, bribe with dairy. You want to laugh, but instead you make a list. What they'll ask, what they might already know, what you'll say if they push. But more than that, you practice stillness, that odd, uncomfortable skill you've honed through years of waiting for bread to rise in cold rooms. The tribunal is held in the old grain hall. You arrive at dawn, clutching a forged certificate in one hand and a perfectly ordinary roll in the other. No symbolism, no hidden message, just a good roll. If you're going down, you want to eat well. The chamber smells like dust, ink, and bureaucratic sweat. The three magistrates squint at you over parchment mountains. They ask questions. Where do your eggs come from? How many apprentices do you have? Have you ever sold a product labeled moon charged? You keep your answers short. Soft, da bland even. When they ask about the oven, you pause just a second too long. Is it true, one of them says, that your so-called bakery school distributes forged grain licenses? You tilt your head. Wouldn't a school teach literacy first? There's a pause, a scribble, a sigh. Then Bartolomeo, definitely Bartolomeo, even though he's never introduced himself, leans forward and says, "We've been told you are the goose." You blink. I am. A baker. Don't play coy. The network, the marks, the coordination. We know it started in your shop. You let out a breath. If people are helping each other survive, I think that's just what cities do. He sits back. One of the others mutters, "Historians will blame us for this, you know." The chamber grows very still, and then the unexpected happens. A pigeon lands on the windowsill. In its beak, a crust of bread, possibly your recipe. It's hard to say from this distance, but it tilts its head at the magistrates like a feathered punctuation mark. The oldest magistrate lets out a snort. Dismissed, we'll let you know if charges are filed. You bow politely, leave the roll on the table, walk out with your pulse hammering behind your ribs. Back at the oven, everyone's waiting. You say, "They called me a goose." Everyone laughs, even Rosa. That night, you bake late. No customers, no deliveries, just you and the oven, and a batch of rolls shaped like wings, not for sale, just reminders. Reminders that quiet can be resistance, that cooperation is power, that bread, at its most basic, is a shared story, and you're still writing yours. You wake to the smell of cardamom and sea fog. Rosa's already in the kitchen, humming an off-key tune as she dusts the countertop with rice flour. She doesn't look up as you enter, just says, "You're famous now, you know." You yawn. For being a goose, she smiles. No, for surviving a tribunal without crying. You don't mention the moment outside the grain hall where you had to sit down for a long time and breathe into your apron. It doesn't feel relevant anymore. The important thing is that the oven still stands and the bread still rises. Across the city, something has shifted. Customers start coming in, not just for bread, but for stories. A dock worker brings his niece, who wants to see the goose lady. A traveling musician trades rhymes for a cherry twist. A noblewoman, veiled and nervous, buys a dozen feather rolls and whispers, "For my son, he reads your poetry under the covers." You blink. "I don't write poetry." She smiles. Then you have a ghost poet. You find a note tucked inside your supply sack that night. If the crust breaks, let it sing. Let flour fly. Let ovens ring. The crumbs still him. Historians still argue whether the crumb was one person or many, some sort of underground network, using the myth of a single crust-eating poet to keep morale up. Others claim it was a lonely magistrate who defected in spirit, if not in law. No one's certain. But the notes keep coming. Some are riddles, some are jokes. One is a detailed recipe for invisible soup, which is just hot water and confidence. You start slipping tiny verses into your loaves too. Harmless things, dreamy things. This bread contains 3 clouds and a whisper. If lost, follow the smell of almonds. The inspectors never catch on, or maybe they just don't want to. Meanwhile, new laws roll in with the tide. You're no longer allowed to use the phrase oven-born. Rosa nearly faints from laughter. You rebrand your signature rolls as warmly materialized. Dried fruit becomes a luxury item. Morel trades with a retired gondolier to sneak in plums hidden in the hollow base of his paddle. You repay him with a bag of fig muffins shaped like turtles. Why turtles? You don't ask. He seems touched. Then comes the oddest law yet. Bakers must now report the number of loaves they make per day in person to a clerk named Enzio, who is known for mispronouncing everything and smelling vaguely like wet rope. You prepare for this by sending Rosa in your place, dressed in your apron and muttering about gluten hauntings. Enzio never notices. Mireille draws a doodle of him on the back of a grain receipt. You tape it to the wall above the oven, but beneath the jokes, there's tension. Several bakeries go quiet. One disappears altogether, just a shuttered door and a crooked sign that says "Gone Chasing Yeast." No one talks about it, but you all feel it. Matteo delivers flour laced with a warning. Be careful. The magistrates are tired of bread as metaphor, tired of symbols, tired of the quiet revolt baked into every loaf. You respond the only way you know how. You host a night bake. It's supposed to be secret, but of course it isn't. Dozens show up. Bakers, students, gondoliers, 2 scholars from the university who claim to be researching the sociology of dough. You let them in anyway. They bring honey. The oven glows hot, and you shape dough by candlelight. Someone sings. Someone else reads one of the crumbs verses in a dramatic voice. It's not a protest, not officially, just bread and people and warmth. But it feels like rebellion. At dawn, you hand out bags of steaming rolls, no labels, no notes, just the smell of something whole. One child tugs your sleeve and says, "I want to bake like you someday." You crouch down, press a floury finger to their nose and say, "You already do." Later that week, a note appears in your apron pocket. Tonight, the geese take wing, just that, no explanation. You gather the team. Rosa brings her lantern. Mireille sharpens a quill. Your apprentice loads up the delivery basket with extra loaves, marked in subtle ways. A curl here, a slash there like little breadcrumbs through the city. The plan isn't clear because there is no plan. There is only movement. You deliver bread all night to all corners of the city. Every door that opens is sleepy, hopeful. Some houses give you coins. Some give you stories. Some give you nothing but a quiet nod. And at sunrise, the geese appear, painted in blue ink on the sides of fishing boats, chalked in dusty white on the bridges, baked into crusts, drawn in the fog on glass, dozens, maybe hundreds. The winged goose has taken flight, and Venice, tired, hungry, suspicious Venice, lets it, just for a moment. You're wiping soot from your forearms when Mireille steps into the bakery, holding a folded piece of parchment with edges singed from a nearby torch. "They're calling for a census," she says. No greeting, but not of people, of ovens. You blink? Ovens? Yes, all heat-producing installations must now be registered with the Department of Civic Containment. You pause. Do they think the uprising is coming from our stoves? She raises an eyebrow. I think they're trying to smother warmth. You run a cloth over the hearthstones, slow, thoughtful. Well, you murmur, ours is an unusually talkative oven. This, of course, is true. Ever since Matteo rewired the flue and Rosa tossed in that bundle of dried fennel, your oven groans in a distinct rhythm every time it reaches precisely 212 degrees. Not a complaint exactly, more like a song, a sleepy, smoky hum that vibrates through the flour bags. The census clerks arrive the next morning, 2 of them, young, nervous. One has a clipboard, and the other wears a hat that might once have belonged to a fishmonger. You ask them if they'd like some tea. They say yes, but cautiously. You lead them into the warm heart of your bakery and gesture at the oven, which rumbles obligingly. It's a prototype, you lie smoothly, for musical baking. The one with the clipboard squints. Is that legal? Well, you say, sprinkling cinnamon onto a resting pastry. There's no law against it yet. They stay for 2 muffins, write down some figures, and leave without asking to measure the oven's temperature. The goose chalked on the back door goes unnoticed, but the city doesn't quiet down. If anything, it hums louder. Historians still argue over what exactly made the goose movement catch fire. Was it the poetry, the bread, the simple dignity of shared labor? But those who lived it agree. It wasn't a riot, it was a rhythm. It's hard to outlaw rhythm, especially when people carry it in their bones. At dusk, Mireille and Rosa return from a meeting in the tailor's district with sacks full of laces and paper. We're printing verse now, Mireille says. Not political, just dreams. You contribute lines between batches. Every crust holds memory. Heat remakes the weary. They're printed on parchment and tucked into loaves. Not every customer notices, but some do. A gondolier reads one aloud while tying his skiff. A midwife, exhausted and covered in flour from a panicked delivery, presses hers to her chest and says nothing. Meanwhile, a new problem arises. The yeast stops working. At first, you think it's the weather, then maybe the flour. But soon, bakeries across Venice start whispering the same thing. The dough won't rise. You call it the slump. No one knows why it happens. Historians blame poor grain imports or a shift in water quality. Some suggest sabotage, deliberate tampering with yeast jars by officials trying to quell the goose bakeries. But nothing is proven, and bread, no matter your theories, does not rise. You try everything. Warm towels, longer rests, spells muttered under your breath, like you're sweet-talking the dough into breathing. You feed your sourdough starter music. Rosa leaves it a poem. Mireille draws tiny eyes on the jars and whispers, "Please." Still nothing. Until one night you give up. You shape the collapsed dough into a flat cake, brush it with oil, dust it with salt and thyme, and slide it into the oven with a sigh. It emerges. Incredible. Not bread. Something else. Crackly edges. A tender center. A depth of flavor like it's been waiting its whole life to be misunderstood. You call it sleep crust, and the name sticks. Soon, sleep crusts replace your morning rolls. Patrons eat them on gondolas, folded in half like sleepy letters. You sell out before noon. Other bakers follow suit, adapting the formula, adding seeds, figs, even nuts. The city adjusts. Sometimes the yeast fails you, but people don't. Then one evening, Crumb returns, not in person, not directly, but in the form of a folded paper tucked beneath your scales. It reads, "When heat fails, us bake flatter dreams. The crust is not the end." You place it on the mantel beside the portrait of your oven you once drew in charcoal. You think of calling your bakery Flatter Dreams. But Mireille reminds you that Venice loves melodrama, not minimalism. Still, the crusts remain. A woman from Florence visits and asks if she can take some home. "They help my daughter sleep," she says. You nod and add an extra to her basket, wrapped in lavender-scented cloth, and through all this, the magistrates say nothing. No fines, no warnings, not even a note. Historians still argue whether this was leniency or exhaustion. You think maybe they were just hungry too. The fog rolls in thicker than usual tonight, dense enough to muffle footsteps, heavy enough to soften the clatter of gondolas on the canal walls. You stand at the bakery door, breathing in the damp, flour-laced air, wondering if Venice has always been made of fog and bread, and everyone else just forgot. Rosa leans out beside you with a steaming mug of chicory and says, "It's soup weather." You nod. "Or revolution weather." She snorts. "Same thing lately. The city isn't quiet, just quiet in a strange way, like it's waiting for something, or baking something slowly, deep in its belly." Then comes the decree, printed in smudged ink on parchment, posted near every well and market stall. All bakers must submit to taste evaluation, signed by someone who has probably never eaten a crust with their hands. At first, you think it's a joke. Taste evaluation? What does that even mean? You soon find out. 3 days later, the inspectors arrive, grim-faced, overdressed, and clearly unprepared for the warmth of your bakery. They sit at your counter with tiny spoons and thin notebooks. One has an official sash, though it's worn over an apron like he couldn't decide what persona to commit to. You offer them sleep crusts, spiced buns, and a new creation. Mireille dubbed midnight brioche. They take delicate bites. They scribble. Then one of them, the shortest, looks up and says, "This is emotionally manipulative." You blink. "It's cinnamon." "Yes," they reply. "Weaponized cinnamon." You and Rosa exchange a glance. The man with the sash frowns deeply, which probably means he liked it but doesn't want to admit it. Historians still argue about this moment, whether it was the last honest review of Goose Bakery goods before censorship took hold, or merely a byproduct of bureaucratic indigestion. The final verdict arrives in the form of an envelope with a gold seal. Approved. Conditional, must monitor emotional effects of spices. You pin it to the wall. Mireille draws a tiny crying cinnamon bun beside it. You keep baking, and the crusts keep working. The sleep crust becomes so popular that nearby islands send for shipments. One friar claims he saw a vision of Saint Apollonia after eating two, and now considers carbs a form of prayer. A noble commissions a whole banquet with only flatbreads, each inscribed with short, hopeful phrases. You are held, so you are more than crust. You're not sure if he understood the irony, but the goose returns. One morning, drawn in fine white flour on your doorstep, elegant, stylized, facing forward, wings gently unfurled. No one takes credit. Not Rosa, not Mireille, not even the baker down the alley who once sculpted a whole battle scene out of marzipan and blamed it on divine intervention. It's just there, waiting. You leave it undisturbed. Customers step carefully over it, nodding like it's an old friend. Children throw petals. One man kneels beside it and whispers, "Thank you," as if it might nod back. And then come the letters, folded into loaves, hidden in baskets, scribbled on the backs of receipts, short, quiet things. My mother cried when she bit into the crust. My wife dreams better now. My son tried baking again. And then, can I learn? That one stops you. It's not addressed to anyone, just slipped under the door, the handwriting uneven but determined. You show it to Rosa and Mireille. They nod. So you start teaching, not formally, not with certificates or apprenticeships, just late-night classes, a warm oven, extra dough, a bench wiped clean. People come with nervous hands and hopeful eyes. You teach them how to feel the dough's breath, how to coax rise from rest. You show them where the dough sticks when it's still thinking, and how silence is sometimes the best teacher. You don't charge them. You do, however, require a joke at the start of each lesson. This turns out to be the most effective part. You hear dozens, bad ones mostly. What do you call a sleepy baker? A dozer. Why did the baguette start therapy? Crust issues, but laughter makes the dough lighter somehow. One night, a boy brings in his grandmother. She can't see well anymore, but her hands know the shape of a need. You place a bowl in front of her, and she sighs like returning home. The next week, she brings a braid of honey bread shaped like a spiral. It's not perfect, but it smells like memory. Rosa cries, not a big cry, just a little glisten, and the inspectors never return. You wonder if they're watching, if someone is listening, if some ledger is being filled with names and oven temperatures and spice profiles, but nothing happens, and maybe that's the victory. Historians still argue whether this was a strategic retreat by the authorities or a passive surrender to something softer, older, too warm to crush with rules. But you know the truth. The crust doesn't care who's watching. It rises in darkness, regardless. Tonight, the city smells like orange blossom and rainwater. You're rolling out dough in the early hours, hands dusted in flour, when you hear singing from across the canal, low, off-key, and oddly comforting. Someone is humming the goose lullaby. Rosa sticks her head in from the storeroom. They're doing it again. Which part? The tailors. They're baking pants. You pause mid-roll. They're baking them? No, sorry. Wearing bread-themed pants while baking. It's become a thing. You stare. Why? She shrugs. Artisanal protest. Or boredom. Hard to say. Mireille, passing through with an armful of fennel bulbs, adds, either way, they've named their oven Goosey. The goose movement, as it's now openly called, has outgrown secrecy. The symbol appears in chalk and ash, thread and cinnamon sugar. Children wear it on capes. Street musicians slip it into songs. Someone even stamps it onto wax seals. The authorities issue a statement warning against flour-based sedition. No one takes it seriously. Well, almost no one. A new law is passed quietly late one evening. The commerce of comfort is to be monitored, vague, poetic, and slightly ominous. You're not sure what it means until the visits begin again, not from taste testers this time, but from the Bureau of Emotive Goods. An invented office, obviously. The man who introduces himself as an inspector of warm feelings doesn't even bring a clipboard. People say your loaves encourage sentiment, he murmurs, walking around the bakery like he's trying not to wake the walls. You nod. Is that bad? He squints at a basket of sleep crusts. Depends on the sentiment. You offer him a slice. He accepts, reluctantly. He stops, chews again. Then unexpectedly, he sits down. Reminds me of my aunt's kitchen, he says after a long pause. She wore clove oil like perfume. You smile. We use cloves sometimes in the winter batches. He finishes the slice and stands awkwardly. Technically, I should file a concern. But He looks at the ceiling as if consulting an invisible conscience. But I think I'll lose the form. Historians still argue whether this marked the first defection of a state official to the goose cause, or was simply an overworked man craving softness. But skits, either way, you don't see him again. Instead, you receive a package 2 weeks later. An old, hand-carved rolling pin, worn smooth from use. No note. Just a tiny goose burned into the wood at one end. You hang it above the oven. The bakery changes, not quickly, not loudly, but it begins to breathe more openly. You extend hours, not for profit, but for people who work odd shifts and need warmth before dawn. The window stays lit. A small candelabra flickers in the corner, not for light, but for gentleness. And then, one rainy afternoon, a woman arrives carrying a crate labeled Yeast Library. You raise your eyebrows. I collect strains, she explains. Lost ones, ancient ones, temperamental ones. This one's from Alexandria, maybe. Murray circles her like a curious cat. What does it do? It dreams. The woman says. You nod slowly. Of course it does. The strain is indeed peculiar. It doesn't rise fast, but it hums, subtly. You swear the dough feels thoughtful, like it's considering whether to trust you. You start small, a batch of sleepy focaccia with rosemary and sea salt. The crust is uneven. The middle sinks slightly, but the taste, it lingers. Not like spice or sweetness. Like a story, the yeast strain becomes the talk of the canal. Other bakers beg for samples. You share a little, not all, just enough to keep the warmth moving. And one day, you catch Rosa talking to the dough, just murmuring little things. You're doing great. You're stronger than yesterday. Rise how you want. I'll wait. You don't say anything. But you leave her favorite tea by her station the next morning. And then the baking circle begins. Not officially. No invitations. Just people showing up. A weaver with a bowl of apple cider starter. A widow with saffron she's been saving. A retired doctor who brings honey from rooftop hives. They don't bake for sales. They bake for reasons. For grief. For boredom. For joy. For the sheer refusal to let quiet hands go unused. Historians still argue whether this was a form of civil resistance or just communal therapy. But it's both. You give them space. Let the oven stay hot. Let the windows fog. Let the bread rise. The seasons shift. The fog lifts earlier now, and the breeze carries smells of basil and wet stone. Morning comes sooner, though no one minds. Bakers, it turns out, are mostly immune to sunrise. Today, there's a knock before dawn, not the usual shuffle of a sleepy customer or the awkward cough of someone hoping for yesterday's leftovers. This knock is deliberate, rhythmic. Rosa peers through the window. It's the mosaicist. You blink. The who? She opens the door. A man steps in, short and wide, his hands stained with blue glass dust and flour. Not a combination you expected. I'm here to talk tiles, he says cheerfully. It turns out he's been baking for months, quietly, in a crumbling courtyard studio once used for storing boats. His loaves are square, tiled with herbs. He calls them bread tesserae. You stifle a laugh. Mosaic bread? Every slice tells a story, he says. Mine says, I overproofed again. The mosaicist stays for tea, then leaves behind a gift, a single tile made of compressed flour and egg yolk, etched with the goose. It crumbles if you touch it, completely impractical, but beautiful. You put it in the front window anyway, and people begin leaving their own offerings. A candied fig, a painted pebble, a tiny poem about kneading. The bakery becomes something else, not just a place to buy food, but a kind of gentle archive, a museum of memory, a soft resistance to forgetting. It's Rosa who starts calling it the Crumb Library. It catches on. There's no card catalog, no organization, just little things, tokens, fragments, left behind like footprints. Some disappear, some remain. A dried lavender wreath, a baby's shoe, a carving of a snail on a walnut shell. No one speaks of ownership, they're just there. Historians still argue whether the Crumb Library was a proto-art movement, a ritual, or an accidental shrine. One professor wrote a thesis titled The Emotional Yeast of Subaltern Venice, and was never invited to dinner again. But none of that matters here. What matters is that a boy named Timo finds an old flour sifter under the bench and claims it as his dragon whisperer. He wears it like a crown. You don't stop him. One evening, a couple brings in their toddler, half asleep, wrapped in a shawl, clutching a crust like a talisman. They say she won't sleep without one. You ask if it's the smell, the taste, the warmth. No, says the mother, it's the ritual. She holds it and says goodnight to the dough. Mireille, in the back, pretends not to cry. Rosa hands the girl a fresh one, just warm. The toddler stares at it, whispers, "See you in dreams," and promptly falls asleep against her father's chest. Outside, the city keeps drifting sideways through history. Minor Noble tries to outlaw sourdough, calling it a gateway to sentiment. He's ignored. Someone proposes a statue in honor of the goose. The sculptor wants to make it out of discarded bread peels. You nod supportively and hope it holds up in the rain. And one night, unannounced, the first inspector returns. He's older now, his sash faded to beige. He doesn't say anything at first, just watches as you fold dough, flour your hands, offer a smile, then quietly, "I miss the smell." You nod, it missed you back. He doesn't stay long, just enough to eat a sleep crust, just enough to breathe deeper than when he arrived. And as he leaves, he presses something into your hand. It's the original complaint form, yellowed and bent. On it, in neat ink, resolved, you frame it next to the goose tile. No one asks why, because everyone knows. You don't need to file paperwork for peace. You just need flour and quiet, and a willingness to wait through the rise. And the goose never leaves. Sometimes it appears in dreams, sometimes in the flour dust on the counter, and sometimes on mornings when you're alone. You swear you see it ripple in the steam above the oven, wings spread wide, watching, not guarding, just resting, because now it doesn't have to fight. You've done the kneading. The dough remembers. The mornings are quieter now, not because the city has hushed, but because you've learned how to listen between the noise. You hear the water wheel creak in slow rhythm. You hear a spoon clink softly against the side of a clay pot. You hear Rosa humming as she pinches dough into little moon-shaped pockets, and Mireille whispering instructions to the starter, as if it's a temperamental cat. And one day, a young woman appears holding a book that isn't really a book. It's wrapped in cheesecloth, bound with lavender twine. When she unwraps it, you realize it's a collection of pressed doughs, flat as paper, some with seeds, others tinted with saffron or beetroot. Each one contains a poem written in edible ink. I call them Crumb Chronicles, she says. You read one aloud. It's about her grandmother and the way she used to hum while baking dumplings for the night shift dock hands. You don't even make it to the second stanza before your throat tightens. She leaves them with you, no charge, no conditions. Just says, stories should be warm. You shelve them beside the sleep crusts and call it the quiet corner. Soon, others add to it. Someone writes a lullaby in barley flour and fennel seed. Someone else donates a dough-sculpted miniature of the Grand Canal, complete with olive pit gondolas. A pair of twins leaves behind a chessboard made entirely of stale rye, knights and all. A city archivist drops by to catalog the collection. She wears round glasses and smells faintly of paper and parchment. "This isn't legal archiving," she says, leafing through the poems. "It's emotional curating." You smile. Same thing, really. She leaves behind a logbook labeled Feelings Noticed. People start filling it in with whatever they want. "Today I felt like a warm spoon. The steam smelled like my grandfather's scarf. I remembered how to laugh while waiting for the rye to proof." Historians still argue whether this logbook represents the earliest form of emotional urban mapping. They also argue about who invented the phrase bread-based empathy zones. But you don't care, because one evening a storm rolls in, wild and sudden. The streets flood within an hour. Water sloshes into the lower steps of the bakery. The power flickers, and people come running, not away, toward you, carrying trays, buckets, starter jars wrapped in towels, old loaves they couldn't leave behind. They come by rowboat, by pulley baskets, by linked arms. No one panics, they just gather. They bake by candlelight, Ned with rain-damp hands. Someone sings a lullaby in a dialect you don't recognize, and someone else replies with a harmony that could have come from the Alps or a lullaby in disguise. You light a lantern, place it in the window. A baby cries. Rosa distracts it with a plum tart. The mosaicist appears with waterproof tiles and fixes a leak in the ceiling. Morello stands by the oven and says, "We're heat rich, let's use it." They do, and as the storm howls, people take turns napping on flour sacks, cuddling loaves for warmth, whispering to dough about things they haven't said out loud in years. The goose appears in the condensation on the glass. You swear it winks, and when morning comes, and the storm passes, and the sun hits the bakery just so, you realize nothing fell apart. The loaves rose, the warmth held. You are, in some strange way, more whole than before, and now, when new visitors come, tired travelers, curious students, or people who got lost on purpose, you welcome them with a slice and a story. You don't ask what brought them here. You just hand them a logbook and let the dough do the listening. You start noticing a pattern, not in the dough, but in the people. They arrive looking unsure, eyes tired, shoulders pulled up, guarded. They speak in low voices. They ask for something small, something not too fancy, something that travels well. You give them whatever's fresh, wrapped gently in cloth, and you always include a second piece, unrequested. They often return. One man, hair wild and eyebrows like tiny hedges, says nothing on his first visit. On the second, he leaves behind a drawing of a fish-shaped loaf with wings. By the third visit, he explains, "I used to be a cartographer. Now I just float." You nod. Bread map's better anyway. He laughs softly and sits in the corner for 3 hours without saying another word. Just breathing, just being, that's enough. And then there's the old woman who comes every Tuesday, always in a green shawl, always asking if the sleep crusts are ready. You give her 3. She pays in old coins that no longer match any currency, but feel somehow heavier than gold. You never ask where she goes. Sometimes you spot her watching the pigeons as if they've said something clever. The bakery isn't officially a hostel, but over time it becomes one, kind of. People leave folded blankets in the corner. Someone donates a cot. Rosa sews a pillow shaped like a baguette. Mireille sculpts a tiny bed out of stale bread and places a single almond where the head would go. For dreams, she says. Historians still argue whether this was a sleep clinic, a bread cult, or an early mental health cooperative. The city inspector, who visits in spring, decides to call it an artisanal rest station. He scribbles it on his clipboard and eats 3 honey oat twists in silence before sighing. I was going to fine you, but now I don't have the heart. You give him a napkin with a doodle of the goose. He nods and leaves. The goose has become something of a mascot now. It's not just the carved emblem over the door. It's painted on aprons, sketched onto paper bags, and occasionally piped into frosting on celebration rolls. No one remembers when people started saying, "Go with the goose" instead of "goodbye," but it happens often enough now that it no longer feels strange. And then one day, someone brings in a child who doesn't speak. She clings to her father's leg, staring at the counter as if it might bite her. You hand her a crust shaped like a sleeping cat. You whisper, "This one purrs if you listen closely." She doesn't smile, but she holds it close, doesn't eat it, just holds it. And when they leave, she leaves behind a tiny feather made of dough. You pin it on the wall. That evening, Mireille sets up a little sign next to the quiet corner. Leave something small, find something soft. No rules, no returns. It's written in chalk. Every morning, someone edits it. Leave something sleepy. Find something you forgot. Please no pickled fish in the return basket. You let it evolve. And it's around this time that bakers from other districts start visiting. One wears shoes made of dried gingerbread. Another insists that the secret to peaceful dough is Gregorian chant. A third tries to convert your starter with strong opinions about cinnamon. Some stay a night, others a week. All of them leave a mark. Recipes scribbled in the margins of logbooks, spices traded like rare gems, a whispered joke passed from loaf to loaf. Someone suggests forming a guild of restorative bakers. You offer to host the first meeting. It consists of 6 people, 12 loaves, 2 arguments about spelt, and 1 group nap. By dawn, the bylaws are written in frosting on a cooling rack. All are welcome. Respect the crust. Sleep is sacred. If in doubt, knead gently. They call it the soft order. No one takes minutes, but everyone remembers. Because in the end, you don't need parchment to hold a story. You just need flour, heat, and time, and a place to sit with your sorrow until it turns golden at the edges. You're woken early by the smell of something unfamiliar. It's bread, yes, but infused with something sharp, something strange. You wander downstairs, still blinking sleep from your eyes, and find Rosa standing at the oven, holding a loaf tinted deep purple. "Violets," she says. You raise an eyebrow. "They were growing behind the apothecaries," she explains, as if this justifies everything. You taste it, it's floral, sure, but also grounded, like a dream with muddy boots. By mid-morning, someone suggests using the crumbs to scent pillows. Mireille makes a prototype by stuffing a sachet with crushed crust and lavender. She calls it Crumb Fort. You wonder aloud if it's safe to fall asleep smelling bread. Mireille shrugs. Only one way to find out. And so begins the great slumber trials. Customers volunteer, some skeptically, others with eager snores. You stack wool blankets on benches, light candles that smell like anise and milk, play the soft sound of proofing bubbles from a hidden phonograph. Each participant is given a different loaf pillow, some with nutmeg crusts, others full of lemon zest crumbs, one perhaps ill-advisedly infused with aged blue cheese. Results vary. Some report vivid dreams of fields and lakes. One man claims he had a vision of an enormous butter churn that spoke Latin. Historians still argue whether this qualifies as the earliest known attempt at scent-based sleep therapy. They also debate whether your bakery had, by this point, transformed into a hybrid dream incubator, a snoozatorium, one scholar calls it. But you don't debate. You just collect the used crumb pillows, shake out the feathers, and bake them into new stories. Soon, a gentle sort of tourism emerges. People start coming from across the countryside, not just for the loaves, but for the legend. They've heard rumors of the sleep crusts, of the goose, of the wall of edible poems. Some think it's a myth. Others bring gifts, bottles of honey from distant hills, bundles of rare herbs, candles shaped like barley stalks. One visitor, an elderly monk with a basket of truffle oil, kneels in front of the oven and whispers, "I came to remember how my grandmother's bread sounded." You say nothing, you just open the door. The smell rushes out, a wave of warmth, spice, and something impossible to name. He begins to cry. That afternoon, Rosa bakes a loaf shaped like an ear. You call it the listener. It becomes the bakery's most popular offering. People buy them to give to friends who've had hard weeks, to carry on quiet walks, to hold while sitting on rooftops, staring at clouds that look like forgotten memories. One day, a letter arrives. It's addressed to the gentle bakers, somewhere between the city and a nap. Inside is a note written in icing on dried parchment. Your bread reminded me who I used to be. That's all. Thank you. Mireille reads it aloud, then folds it carefully, places it in the logbook under a new heading, Crumbs of Gratitude, and without really planning it, you start to keep a record of these quiet thanks. Pressed napkins with tiny smiley faces, scraps of poems written in sugar, doodles of sleepy loaves beside suns with droopy eyes. The goose, now painted above the oven in gold flour dust, seems to smile. But the best the thank you comes one evening from a girl no older than 7. She comes in, holding a drawing, the bakery, with steam curls rising into hearts. She hands it to you and says, "I don't know what this place is, but it feels like bedtime." You nod, because that's the point. Not perfection, not prestige, just comfort, just presence, just the steady, slow rhythm of a world baked gently, one that listens back. By now, the city has noticed you, not just the wanderers and dreamers. The officials have noticed. First, it's a letter from the Office of Civic Commerce, requesting clarification on whether you are a registered bakery, social club, or spiritual refuge. You reply with a small almond loaf and a note that reads, "Yes." A week later, a clerk visits. He arrives in a pressed uniform, carrying a clipboard and the stiff posture of someone who has never napped under a proofing table. You offer him a honey doze bun. He declines. But then, after a long look at Rosa snoring gently on a sack of flour, and a group of customers playing a quiet round of Name That Spice in the corner, he clears his throat and asks, "Is this permitted?" You answer with a shrug, "Is breathing permitted?" He stays for an hour, leaves with 2 buns in his coat pocket. Historians still argue whether this was the moment the bakery became untouchable by local law. What is clear is that from that point on, no one tries to regulate you again. Instead, they join you. The tailor next door starts offering nap robes, linen smocks with extra room around the belly for post-loaf relaxation. The candle maker across the alley invents a line of dream flickers, each wick soaked in bread-scented oils. Even the city guards stop by now and then, leaning against the doorway in the evening, chewing crusts and exchanging their dreams like gossip. One confesses, "I dreamt I was a loaf on trial. The judge was butter." You nod solemnly. Sounds like guilt rising. He chuckles for 6 straight minutes. Meanwhile, a new loaf is born. You don't name it. Customers do. They call it the fog. It's soft, unfocused, a mix of 5 flours, no crust, no shape, barely a crumb. It vanishes in your mouth like a memory. It becomes popular with people who say they just want to feel slightly less awake. And then there's the breadcrumb. It's not food, it's a ritual. Each night before closing, one baker walks the length of the shop, sprinkling a few golden crumbs onto the sill and whispering, "Sleep well, whoever you are." You don't know why this started, but now it feels wrong not to do it. Mireille insists it helps pigeons dream more vividly. You let her have that. But amidst all the cozy comfort, there are moments when the world outside creeps in. One night, a man bangs on the door, soaked with rain and fury. He demands you stop this nonsense. Says sleep is a weakness. Bread is just food. Life is hard and waking up is worse. You give him tea, a dry blanket, a crust with a curl of honey. He doesn't speak for a while, but eventually, as he warms by the oven and the bakery's gentle hum wraps around him, he says, "I used to bake, in the war, for the wounded." You nod. He sleeps in the quiet corner that night, and in the morning, he's the one who sprinkles the crumbs. That's how the bakery works now. You don't force anything, you just offer space, flour, heat, time. People bring their own stories. They knead them in silence, bake them into shape, tear them open with their hands. You've become less a baker, more a steward, a dream wrangler, and as the seasons turn and the days drift like flour dust, you find that your own dreams have slowed too, no longer frantic or rushed, no longer full of worry about the guild or inspections or the perfect rise. Now you dream of crusts cooling under stars, of laughter echoing off stone walls, of a goose, enormous and golden, gliding above the rooftops, trailing sweet steam behind her. You wake up smiling, because even in sleep, you're still baking. There's a morning, quiet, pale, barely awake, when you realize something has changed. The dough, still resting under its damp cloth, seems to rise with more purpose. The bakers move more slowly, not out of fatigue, but as if savoring each gesture. The smell in the air isn't just comforting, it's familiar, sacred, like a lullaby someone baked into the walls years ago. You stand at the window, watching mist curl through the alley, and you see them, not just your regulars, though there's Mireille in her flour-splotched apron, and Rosa stacking loaves like books in a library of crust. You see strangers arriving, led by stories, carried by whispers, drawn in by the quiet magnetism of bread that isn't just bread. One carries a lute, another a folded map drawn in butter. You wave them in. Inside, the bakery has changed, not larger, not fancier, just more itself. Every surface bears the history of hands, the notches in the wood where you cut your first mistake loaf, the wall near the oven where someone etched a sleepy poem in cinnamon, the back corner is where loaves go to rest beside napkins soaked in lemon balm, a small museum of crumbs and comfort. There's a new bench in the corner now, made from old mixing bowls and the spine of a broken paddle. On it sits an old man, eyes closed, not sleeping, just listening. You can hear it too, the heartbeat of the place, that low hum of fire and breath, the sound of people exhaling as they walk through the door, the whisper of crust cooling into silence. Some call this magic, others call it luck. Historians still argue whether it was the location, the recipes, or the atmosphere of deliberate slowness that made the place legendary. But you don't argue, you just keep baking. And one night, someone leaves behind a letter tucked under a saucer. It reads, "I came here heavy. I'm leaving slightly lighter, not because anything changed, just because I remembered how to rest." You fold the letter, place it in the logbook, next to the truffle monk's note and the girl's crayon bakery drawing. Then you step outside. The stars hang like rising bubbles in a slow, clear dough. You stretch, yawn, let the air fill your lungs like warm oven breath. Rosa joins you. She leans against the doorframe, watching a cat curl up on a still warm bread crate. "You think we'll always do this?" she asks. You think, and then you say, "As long as there's someone who needs a nap and a slice." The goose flutters on the painted wall, wings mid-flap. Somewhere inside, the oven creaks. A crust pops. The world is still, and you smile, because now, finally, everything has risen just right. And now, as the last of the flour settles, and the soft heartbeat of our little bakery quiets to a gentle pulse, you begin to feel the warmth of sleep rising within you. Like dough resting under cloth, you too are wrapped in softness, in the safety of repetition, of simple rituals carried out with care and purpose. Let the scent of imagined crust and sweet herbs linger in your thoughts. Let the flickering candlelight of memory dance behind your closed eyes, where Rosa hums while shaping dough, and Mireille stacks dreams like loaves upon a shelf. You don't need to understand every law that troubled a Renaissance baker. You only need to feel the rhythm of their days, their flour-dusted laughter, their gentle rebellions against noise and haste. With every breath, allow your thoughts to slow, your muscles to loosen, your mind to float like steam above a resting bowl. And as you lie there, half sinking, half drifting, know that somewhere in the in-between world of dreams and ovens, there is always a warm bench by the hearth, a crust just pulled from the fire, a story whispered in crumbs. It waits for you night after night. Sleep well, wherever you are. Good night.